The human body is not made to walk forever. 4,000 miles. This is a distance that breaks machines. It erases maps. It turns continents into counties and deserts into lifetimes. Now imagine walking it. Imagine walking it after emerging from hell. Imagine starting from a place where the sun itself is a prisoner. Siberia, 1941. The heart of the Soviet Gulag. Here, men are not men. They are numbers. They are shadows frozen in the ice. They are ghosts who are forced to work. One of these shadows, a Polish cavalry officer, looked south. He saw a fence of barbed wire. He saw 1,000 miles of snow. And beyond that, 1,000 miles of barren desert. And beyond that, the highest, most impassive mountains on earth. He saw an impossibility, and he chose to walk it. This is the story of Sławomir Rawicz, and it is a testament etched in frost and sand to a single biological imperative: to be free. To understand the walk, you must first understand the cage. It was not simply a prison. It was not a place of reform. The Gulag was a system, a vast continental machine designed to grind human beings into industrial dust. It was an engine of the state, fueled by paranoia and terror, and its purpose was to extract labor from the undesirable, the unlucky, and the innocent until they were dead. Sławomir Rawicz, like millions of others, was a log caught in this terrible river. When his native Poland was devoured by Germany from the west and the Soviet Union from the east, he was a cavalry officer doing his duty. He was captured not in the heat of battle, but by the cold hands of the secret police. The NKVD. There was a trial, but it was not a trial of evidence. It was a trial of narrative, a piece of dark theater written in Moscow. The verdict was preordained: 25 years of hard labor. For what crime? For the crime of being who he was: a Pole, an officer, a patriot. The journey to the prison was the first filter, designed to break the spirit before the body. He was packed into a cattle car. For weeks, the train rattled east, deeper and deeper into the endless white. In the darkness of the car, men suffocated. They froze. They starved. The stench of unwashed bodies, of fear, of death, was a physical thing. It was the first lesson of the Gulag. You are not human. You are cargo. And then they arrived. Camp 303, Siberia. The word itself is a sentence. It is a place where the geography is the warden, and the guards are merely its assistants. Imagine a cold you cannot comprehend. Not the cold that makes you shiver, but a cold that makes you burn. 40 degrees below zero. 50. A cold so profound it feels like glass in the lungs. A cold that freezes the moisture in your eyes and makes the simple act of breathing a conscious, painful effort. The camp was a scar on this white landscape. Wooden barracks, thin as paper, offered almost no defense against the wind. Barbed wire, brittle with frost, defined the perimeter. Watchtowers stood like skeletal sentinels, and inside this fence, life was reduced to two states: exhaustion and hunger. The work was the hammer that broke them. 12 hours a day, felling massive Siberian pines, their axes ringing in the dead, silent air. Building roads that led from nowhere to nowhere. Digging foundations in ground frozen as hard as iron. All of this on a diet designed for starvation. A bowl of watery soup, perhaps with a single fisheye floating in it. A few ounces of wet black bread that tasted of sawdust. This was a mergullo sensorial into despair. The dominant sound was the endless, howling wind, the crunch of boots on packed snow, and the hacking coughs of men whose lungs were failing. The dominant smell was pine, unwashed bodies, and the faint, sour odor of hopelessness. This was a mergullo psicologico into erasure. Men forgot their wives' faces. They forgot the taste of milk. They forgot the feeling of a soft bed. They forgot their own names, responding only to their numbers. Scurvy rotted their gums. Frostbite, the Siberian flower, blackened their fingers and toes. To show weakness was to die. To fall was to be left. But in Rawicz, something stubborn remained. The cavalry officer, the man who had seen the open fields of Poland, the spark of human dignity, buried deep beneath the ice, refused to be extinguished. He studied. He watched. He waited. This was a mergullo tecnico into the anatomy of an escape. He was not just a prisoner. He was a student of his cage. He observed the patrols. He noted the patterns of the guards. He saw that in the vastness of Siberia, the truest prison was the landscape itself. The guards were complacent. They believed escape was suicide. He saw a weakness. The camp commander's wife. She was perhaps lonely. Perhaps she saw the man he had been. She spoke to him. She offered small, fleeting moments of humanity. And through these moments, he learned. He gathered information. A small kindness that would become the key. He was not alone. He found others. Men who, like him, still had a spark. There was Mr. Smith, an American engineer, pragmatic and tough. Kolomenos, a stoic Latvian landowner. Zaro, a man of the forest, who knew plants and animals. Batko, a strong Ukrainian. Marchinkovas and Anastasi, 2 other Poles. 7 men, 7 ghosts. They began to plot, not with maps, but with whispers. They hoarded scraps of bread, hiding them in their clothing, day by day, ounce by ounce. They stole an axe from the worksite. They bartered with their last possessions for scraps of leather and strips of old tire to fashion crude moccasins. They were building the tools of their resurrection. They set a date, not a day, but a condition. A blizzard. It came. A howling white fury that descended upon the camp. A night where the world dissolved into wind and driving snow. The guards huddled in their towers, blind. The dogs whined in their pens, their senses overwhelmed. The snow was not a hindrance. It was a cloak. Under the cover of this chaos, they moved. The wire, the metallic snip of a stolen tool, the sound lost in the shriek of the wind. One by one, they slipped through the gap. They did not run. They walked into the white, into the howling void. 7 men with nothing but an axe, a few pounds of dried bread, and an insane, burning hope. They faced south. The first step of 4,000 miles had been taken. The escape was not the end. It was the beginning of an ordeal so profound it challenges our understanding of survival. The story of what they faced in the wilderness, the loyalty they forged, and the price they paid, is a journey into the very heart of human endurance. If you believe these stories of resilience must be told, support our channel by subscribing. Your support allows us to honor these memories. The first days, perhaps the first weeks, were a blur of white. They had escaped the fence, but they were still prisoners of the taiga, the endless, primordial Siberian forest. This forest was both their sanctuary and their tormentor. It hid them from the patrols they imagined were searching for them, from the dogs they could almost hear barking in their paranoia, but it also tried to kill them with a cold, indifferent power. The mergullo sensorial of this world was one of profound silence, broken only by the crunch of their own feet and the rasp of their breathing. The cold was a physical weight. It pressed against their thin prison clothes. It found every gap, every tear. Their breath froze instantly on their beards and rags. At night, they burrowed into the snow, huddling together for warmth, a knot of shivering humanity. Sleep was not rest. It was a temporary surrender, a dance with hypothermia. Their mergullo psicologico was defined by 2 opposing forces, fear and hope. Every snap of a distant twig was an NKVD soldier. Every shadow in the trees was a wolf. They were haunted by the camp, looking back over their shoulders, convinced that capture was imminent. But driving them forward was the sheer, unbelievable fact that they were out. The air tasted different. It was the air of freedom, and even frozen, it was intoxicating. This was a mergullo tecnico into primitive survival. How did they navigate? They had no compass. They used the sun when it appeared as a pale, weak disk. When there was no sun, they used the moss that grew on the north side of the trees. South. Always south. How did they eat? The bread was gone in days. They were starving. Zaro, the landowner, became their guide. He knew the land. He dug for frozen roots and tubers, his cracked fingers pulling sustenance from the iron-hard earth. They ate bark. They chewed pine needles to stave off the worst of the scurvy. They walked, and they walked. They became specters in the forest. They crossed frozen rivers, the ice groaning beneath their weight, the terrifying sharp crackle that signaled a watery grave just inches below. They would spread out, testing the ice, crawling on their bellies, the frozen water visible beneath them. Then a change. They found a deer, trapped in a snowdrift, weak and dying. The axe, stolen for the fence, now became a tool of life. The psychological impact was profound. They killed it. They ripped it apart with their bare hands and the axe. They ate the meat raw, the warm blood on their faces. They were no longer cavalry officers or engineers. They were hunters. They were primitives. They had done what was necessary. And for the first time in months, they had a full-bodied strength. They cured the remaining meat in the smoke of their small, carefully hidden fires. They saved the skin, curing it as best they could, to patch their failing clothes and moccasins. Weeks turned into a month. The forest began to thin. The snows began to recede. They reached the edge of the taiga. Before them lay two obstacles, two great symbols of the empire they were fleeing. First, the Trans-Siberian Railway, the iron artery of Soviet power stretching from one end of the continent to the other. They hid for a day, watching. The ground trembled. A massive locomotive, belching black smoke, thundered past, a rolling fortress of steel and steam. It was the sound of the civilization that had enslaved them. At night, they ran. They scrambled over the gravel bed, over the cold steel rails, and plunged back into the woods on the other side. Then the second obstacle, Lake Baikal. It was not a lake. It was an ocean of fresh water, the sacred sea of Siberia. And it was frozen solid. The Mergulho sensorial was staggering. They stood on the shore and looked out at a vast white desert of ice that stretched to the horizon. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. There was no hiding on the ice. They would be exposed. They waited for another storm. It came. Under the cover of falling snow, they stepped onto the lake. They walked for days. The ice was miles thick. The wind was relentless, a horizontal blade that cut them to the bone. There was no shelter. There was only the white ice below and the gray, swirling sky above. They reached the other side. They were in Mongolia. They had done it. They had walked out of Siberia, but they were not safe. Mongolia was a Soviet satellite state. The Red Star was everywhere. They had to travel by night, hiding by day, stealing food from farms when their hunger became unbearable. It was here, on the sparse, open plains, in the shadow of the mountains, that they found her. Her name was Christina. She was 17, a Polish girl who had escaped from a brutal collective farm where she had been deported. She was alone, starving, terrified. This was a profound mergulho psychologico for the 7 men. They were a hardened unit. They were moving fast. She was a liability. She was another mouth to feed. She would slow them down. But to leave her? To leave her was to abandon the very humanity they were trying to reclaim. They had escaped the Gulag to be men again, not to be the beasts the Gulag had tried to make them. Mr. Smith, the American, was the first to speak. "We take her." There was no argument. Christina joined them. She was tough, resilient, but she was also a reminder of the world they had lost. Her presence softened them. It gave them a renewed purpose. They were not just escaping, they were protecting. The landscape changed again. The sparse grasslands gave way to scrub. The scrub gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to sand. They had reached the Gobi. The Gobi Desert is not a place of rolling, romantic dunes. It is a 400,000 square mile anvil, a high-altitude desert of gravel plains, salt flats, and treacherous, shifting sands. It is a place the gods forgot to finish. The sun, which had been their distant, pale friend in Siberia, was now their enemy. A white-hot hammer in a cloudless sky. The Mergulho sensorial was absolute. The cold of the taiga was replaced by a blistering, baking heat. The silence of the snow was replaced by a dead, oppressive silence. A silence so total they could hear the blood pounding in their own ears. The heat was a physical thing. It baked the moisture from their bodies. Their skin cracked and bled. Their lips swelled. Their tongues turned to wood. Water. It became the only word, the only thought, the only God. Their crude water skins, made from animal remnants, were useless. The water evaporated. Days passed. How many? They lost count. The walking became mechanical, a stumbling, shuffling trance. Step, step, step. The gravel crunching under their feet. They found snakes. They killed them with the axe and drank their blood, a desperate coppery fluid that was, for a moment, moisture. This is where the mergulho psicologico became a nightmare. The mind breaks before the body. They began to have hallucinations. They saw lakes, shimmering oases, cities in the distance. Mr. Smith, the pragmatic engineer, would suddenly walk off, convinced he saw an American town, and they would have to drag him back. They saw ghosts, the ghosts of the men they had been, the ghosts of their families. The desert was stripping them down to their absolute essence. The group, forged in the ice, began to fray in the fire. Arguments erupted over nothing, over a sip of water, over the pace, and then the desert claimed its first price. Christina. She was young, but the desert does not care for youth. Her body, already weakened by starvation, could not take the lack of water. One afternoon she sat down. She simply said she would rest for a moment. They knew what that meant. In the desert, to stop moving is to die. They tried to carry her, but they were skeletons themselves. They had no strength. She died there, on the gravel plain. She was 17. She had escaped a collective farm, crossed Siberia, survived the taiga, only to be claimed by the sand. They buried her. They scraped a shallow grave in the hard-packed earth with their bare, cracked hands. They piled a small cairn of stones. A piece of their soul was left in the gobi. The walk continued, but something was broken. The lightness she had brought was gone. The desert was not done. Kolomenos, the stoic Latvian, his body, withered by the sun, began to fail. He too sat down. He did not complain. He did not hallucinate. He simply stopped. He waved them on. "Go," he whispered. To stay was to die with him. They left him. They walked on, haunted by the image of the man sitting alone, watching them go. Then another. Marcinkovas. He wandered off in the night, chasing a phantom, and never returned. They were four. Rawich, Mr. Smith, Zaro, Batko. They were no longer men. They were apparitions, skeletons covered in sun-blackened skin, draped in rags. They were about to give up. The thirst was an agony that eclipsed all other thought. And then Zaro, the man of the land, fell to his knees. He began to dig. Frantically, there was moisture. They dug. They found it, a muddy, brackish pool just inches below the surface. They fell upon it. They drank the mud. They were sick. They drank again. It was life. They stumbled on. They found a well, then another. They were out of the worst of it. They had crossed the Gobi. They had walked out of the oven. But they had walked into the sky. They had reached Tibet. This was a new world, a world of profound, echoing silence. The mergulho contextual was jarring. They were in a land of monasteries, of prayer flags, of people who were not Russian, not Chinese. And the people they met were not suspicious. They were not cruel. They were kind. In a small village, people who had almost nothing shared what they had. A mergulho sensorial of taste and smell. Tsampa, roasted barley flour. Salty, pungent yak butter tea. This kindness, after the mechanized brutality of the Gulag and the vast indifference of the desert, was so profound it was almost painful. It was a reminder of a humanity they thought was extinct. It gave them strength. It healed their minds, even as their bodies remained broken. But their journey was not over. To reach their goal, British India, they had to cross the final and greatest barrier. The Himalayas. If the Gobi was an oven, the Himalayas were a void. The mergulho sensorial changed from heat to cold again. But this was a different cold. It was a thin, high-altitude cold. And the air. There was no air. They were at 15, 16, 17,000 feet. Every step was a monumental effort. Their lungs burned. Their hearts pounded in their chests. A desperate drumbeat in the thin atmosphere. Snow blindness. The white was absolute. A searing, blinding light that felt like needles in their eyes. They were above the clouds, above the world. And here, on the final hurdle, the mountains claimed one more. Batko, the strong Ukrainian, the man who had survived the axes of the taiga and the sun of the Gobi. His heart simply gave out in the thin air. He died in the snow. 3 remained. Rawich, Mr. Smith, Zaro. They were no longer walking. They were crawling. They were sliding. They were descending. And then they saw it, below the snow line. Green. Not the dark, menacing green of the Siberian taiga, but a lush, vibrant, impossible green. The green of a jungle. They stumbled down, their legs collapsing. They smelled damp earth. They felt humidity. They heard voices speaking English. They had reached India. It was March 1942. They stumbled out of the foothills onto a path. They saw a group of soldiers, Gurkhas in British uniform. The soldiers did not see men. They saw apparitions. 3 skeletal figures, draped in animal skins and rags, with matted hair that reached their shoulders and sun-scorched, wind-blasted skin. Sławomir Rawicz stepped forward. He tried to speak. His voice was a croak. He managed the words. "We are soldiers." And then, after 11 months and 4,000 miles, they collapsed. They were taken to a hospital in Calcutta. They had to relearn how to eat, how to sleep in a bed, how to be human. They were safe. The war was still raging. Rawicz would rejoin the reconstituted Polish forces. Mr. Smith, after a long recuperation, would find his way back to America. Zaro would vanish into the fog of war. The walk was over. This is the story Sławomir Rawicz told. It was published in a book, The Long Walk. A story so staggering, so beyond the pale of known human endurance, that it became an immediate legend. And like all great legends, it has been questioned. Historians have searched for records. They found documents suggesting Rawicz was released from the Gulag in 1942 as part of a general amnesty for Polish soldiers, that he was transported to Persia. They found no record of his long walk. Another man, Witold Glinski, came forward decades later, claiming the story was his, that Rawicz had heard it and stolen it. His account, too, has gaps and inconsistencies. So what is the truth? Perhaps the truth of this story is not found in a shipping manifest or a prison ledger. The Gulag existed. The suffering was real. The escapes happened. Men and women did walk impossible distances out of that frozen hell. And many perished, their stories lost to the snow. Whether this specific journey of 4,000 miles was undertaken by Rawicz, by Glinski, or whether it is a profound amalgamation of a dozen true stories. The story itself holds an essential, undeniable truth. It is a testament. It speaks to a place deep inside the human blueprint, a place that refuses to be caged, a part of us that, when faced with an impassive, inhuman system, will choose the impossibility of the wilderness over the certainty of the cage. It is a story about the cost of freedom. Kristina, Kolomenos, Marcinkovas, Batko. Their graves are unmarked, 1 in the desert sand, 3 in the ice and snow. They are the currency that was paid for the survival of the others. The story does not ask us to simply be astonished. It asks us to reflect. What is the limit of our own endurance? What fences, real or imagined, do we accept in our own lives? We live in a world of comfort, of convenience. We have forgotten what it means to truly walk. We have forgotten what it means to truly, desperately want to be free. The journey from the ice of Siberia to the warmth of India was more than a measure of distance. It was the measure of a soul. They walked out of the darkness to remind us how to see the light. The memory of this long walk is a lesson in resilience that we must carry forward. These stories are more than history. They are blueprints for the human spirit. If you were moved by this journey and believe in the power of remembrance, please leave a comment below. What part of their walk will stay with you? Your reflection joins a community that honors the past to understand the present. Thank you for listening.